You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Let's turn to the front page. We start every week with the latest news that's relevant to us here in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a first for us. Joining me today for Front Page is Congresswoman Susan DelBene. She represents the East Side from Bellevue all the way up to Arlington. Congresswoman, thank you very much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So let's turn to our top story on the front page.
The Democrats shut down DHS. They voted to shut down DHS because they simply won't fund DHS because they want to change ICE policies so ICE is less effective in the interior.
That's White House border czar Tom Homan on CBS's Face the Nation yesterday. TSA officers are set to get paid today, even as the partial federal government shutdown continues. President Trump signed an emergency order Friday to pay TSA. A Senate deal to fund most of the Department of Homeland Security, excluding ICE and Border Patrol, fell apart because of Republican opposition in the House. So, Congresswoman, I know you were right there, while this was all playing out on Friday. What is your take on what happened here? And obviously, I'd love you to respond to Tom Homan and the administration, who are trying to blame these long lines at airports on Democrats.
The only way to end this or any shutdown is for there to be a bipartisan solution. And the Senate had unanimous agreement. I'll say unanimous again, because unanimous is pretty rare in the environment we're in. And yet House Republicans couldn't take yes for an answer. They had a bipartisan funding deal to make sure that we were funding TSA, FEMA, the Coast Guard, things where there was bipartisan agreement, make sure that TSA workers were getting paid. And yet House Republicans didn't even allow us to have a vote on it. They didn't even bring the bill to the floor. So we're okay continuing to see that shutdown move forward. People across the country want there to be reforms at ICE. They are outraged with the violence that they've seen in communities across the country, American citizens who've been killed. And yet Republicans refuse to come to the table to fund the things we agree on and continue to negotiate on the rest. So this is on them. Speaker Johnson and Republicans across the board just can't do anything unless Donald Trump tells them what to do.
Can I ask more about how these negotiations are going from your standpoint? Because the deal in the Senate, it funded DHS, so Coast Guard, TSA, things like that. It did not fund ICE and Border Patrol, but it also did not include policy changes that you and your fellow Democrats have said you need to see to vote for an end to the shutdown. So things like no masks for ICE agents, requiring judicial warrants for ICE to enter homes. So if the Senate is in this place where it's passing that kind of deal, does that mean Democrats have lost leverage to actually curtail ICE in this shutdown negotiation?
I think that the American people, their voices are incredibly powerful, and people across the country are outraged with what they've seen. And public sentiment is powerful and makes a difference. And if Republicans were actually listening to what their communities were telling them, we would actually see policy move forward. They don't care what their constituents are saying. They don't care. They only care about what Donald Trump tells them to do. And people are seeing that. And people are seeing it across the country. It's why we've seen people stand up across the country to make sure their voices are heard. But it's also why they didn't put the full bill on the floor that they could have to fund the rest of, because it would have passed. And yet Republicans didn't want to see that happen. So if we're going to have solutions, if we're going to have responsible leaders, they have to do their jobs and stand up their communities. Yet Republicans right now are just a rubber stamp for Donald Trump.
Okay, we're going to move on really quickly because there is news about the war with Iran. Here's President Trump for our story number 2 speaking on Air Force One on Sunday.
In a much bigger way, we're ahead of schedule with Iran. We're weeks ahead of schedule. But we've had regime change, if you look already, because the one regime was decimated, destroyed, they're all dead. The next regime is mostly dead. And the third regime, we're dealing with different people than anybody's dealt with before. It's a whole different group of people. So I would consider that regime change. And frankly, they've been very reasonable.
Okay, so President Trump saying there's been regime change in Iran, despite the fact that Mojtaba Khamenei is a hardliner with IRGC support. He was the president sounding optimistic about those talks with Iran on Sunday. Today, though, he struck a more dire tone on social media, and I'm going to read part of the president's Truth Social post. Trump said, "Great progress has been made, but if for any reason a deal is not shortly reached, which it probably will be if the Hormuz Strait is not immediately open for business, we will continue our lovely, quote-unquote, stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants, oil wells, and Karg Island, and possibly all desalination plants we have purposely not yet touched." So, Congresswoman, we've had a lot of mixed signals about where this war is headed. What do you take from what the president has been saying in the last 48 hours or so about how long this war is going to last and when it might come to an end?
Well, I think it's been very clear that the president has no clear goals or objectives. You see this in even his own comments that change on a regular basis. It is critically important that there is a clear plan, that there are clear objectives. That's why it was critically important for the president to come to Congress, because then Congress, which has the say and should have a say here, can look at that and we can understand what those plans and objectives are and what the impact is on the United States and our troops and our national security. He is talking about things going well based on what? Based on what objectives, what timeline? We've seen ongoing military buildup, which is extremely concerning. And he also promised no forever wars. It has been a broken promise, and we still have no idea what his long-term goals are. The Republicans in Congress refuse to do anything to push back on this. And it is also incredibly expensive. We've seen gas prices, grocery prices rising even more. And families all across the country have already been struggling. And we know that the administration is going to ask for even more money to continue military action. Without goals, without a plan. People are frustrated, understandably, across the country and hugely concerned about this impact. We all should be. So there has to be specific plans, and Congress needs to have a say.
I'll note, too, that an interview with the British newspaper The Financial Times published today where Trump said he was considering sending U.S. troops to seize Karg Island, which is where the terminal that Iran sends most of its oil, exports most of its oil from, is located. Congresswoman, I know have your member of Congress hat on right now. You're also the chair of the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and that's the organization that's working to flip the House for Democrats in the fall. I mean, when it comes to this war, what are you seeing and how it's affecting chances in districts across the country, maybe even districts that voted for Trump? Do we know what those numbers are looking like?
Well, first of all, the number one issue across the country and communities is affordability. Families are struggling. Housing, food, healthcare, childcare, energy costs all going up, and going up because of direct actions from Trump and Republicans in Congress. And families are struggling, and you see with the military action, with the war that they've started in Iran, with no objectives, no plan, hugely expensive, and having a direct impact here at home for families who are already struggling. People across the country want folks who are going to stand up for them and who are focused on the issues that matter. And Republicans have been nothing but a rubber stamp for Donald Trump in Congress. And people want folks who are going to stand up for them. So we've seen just incredible opportunities across the country. We have 44 districts where we're on offense across the country. We need to pick up 3 seats. And even in special elections, you've seen folks turning out in strong numbers, Democrats flipping seats, because people are tired of the broken promises. They want folks who are going to stand up for them.
Speaking of elections, that means voting, and that means we're moving on to our third story on Front Page.
Changing the rules right before our August primary is going to cause confusion and concern for voters. And in November, it will, without a doubt, leave thousands without their ballots counted and their voices heard.
That's the voice of King County Elections Director Julie Wise. We caught up with her to ask about the potential for the Supreme Court to invalidate mail-in ballots that are received after Election Day. Oral arguments in a case challenging Mississippi's 5-day grace period happened last week. The official decision in that case is expected by the end of June, but a lot of signs pointing to the possibility that the court stops those ballots from being counted. That could have ripple effects across the country. Obviously, it's just one of the ways that voting could change in the coming months. President Trump has been urging his party to do what it takes to pass the SAVE Act, which would require Americans to present proof of citizenship when they register to vote and photo ID when they go to vote. Congresswoman, how closely are you watching these potential changes to voting, and what impact do you think they could have?
We're watching everything and fighting back because basically Republicans know that they are losing. And instead of listening to the American people and understanding what needs to be done to actually address the issues that people are feeling, they've decided that their focus is going to be on rigging the system. You've seen it in initiating redistricting across the country to try to create a permanent majority for Republicans. People have fought back. You see that in their attempts to undermine the vote and to suppress voters' access to the ballot. That's part of what we see from their legislation, but also their attacks on vote by mail. Vote by mail, making sure that people have access to the ballot. Even President Trump voted by mail in a recent election because he thought it was more convenient. Instead of focusing on what we can do to help make sure that people have access to the ballot and make sure that their voices are heard, they're trying to undermine that. And so they're trying to attack the Voting Rights Act at the Supreme Court. So across the board, we are fighting back, and I think it's important for people to understand what's happening and continue to do what they can to respond, to make sure that not only their voices are heard, but be very, very aware of these attempts to undermine the vote. And we have to be aware locally what they're trying to do and be able to adapt if the Supreme Court does decide to limit votes or ballots that are counted, if they decide that the postmark may not be enough anymore. And we also know that the post office has said that they may not postmark as quickly as they used to. All of these things are important. So again, even in our elections, it's going to be important. Folks, vote, get your ballots in, get them in early, all of those things to make sure that our voices are heard.
Really quickly before we move on, there was this push that Trump wanted the majority leader in the Senate, John Thune, to nuke the filibuster. Then there was a talk about forcing Senate Democrats to do the talking filibuster, which would have had them hold the floor and literally be speaking and standing for hours and hours on end. Now it appears that Republicans will try to pass pieces of the SAVE Act using budget reconciliation. I mean, it's not clear how much they can actually get across the finish line with that budget move, because it has to have a direct impact on the budget. I mean, is some of this going to get across anyway, even if there's still a filibuster? I mean, can you tell what's going to happen yet?
I think they obviously feel strongly that they need to pass this because they know that they're losing. The American people are not with them. So this is a voter suppression bill, very clearly. It would make it harder for legal voters to cast their ballots. And we should also all be clear, it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote. Voters would have to show a passport or birth certificate to register to vote. Not everyone has all the documents readily available, and that could be expensive for folks to have it. But we also know the impact on women in particular, especially anyone who's had their name changed, making it harder for them to vote. They want to share voter data with the Department of Homeland Security. All of these things make it harder for our communities and has nothing to do with anything except for their attempt to try to make it harder and harder for folks' voices to be heard.
Congresswoman, I just want to get to the next story really quick because I know you got to go. So let me just quickly move on because we're going to hop on the train, the light rail, in fact, with our new friend Sam McBride, who's 11 years old from Portland.
We rode across. It was really cool, and the lake is really pretty because it's just big and vast. It was kind of a little bit shaky because you could tell that the waves were moving the bridge, and I think it's really cool.
So that's Sam. He and his mom rode up all the way from Portland to be one of the first to ride Sound Transit's Crosslake Connection. He and I caught up at the Pioneer Square station when I was about to ride it for the first time. Congresswoman, final thoughts here. Sound Transit is connecting the east side, your district, to Seattle at long last. I know you got a chance to ride the train. What does this mean for the community?
It is huge. I know folks have waited a long time. And as someone who has lived on the east side and worked in Seattle and lived in Seattle and worked on the east side and been constantly going back and forth, this is just huge in terms of making it easier for folks to move throughout our region. I got to ride yesterday. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there for the opening because of the votes in Congress. But it's an important connection, but this is going to make it so much easier and faster for folks to go all the way from Linwood to Redmond on the 2 line. And so excited to get to experience it myself. But I know even yesterday, tons of folks out going to Mariners game or Torrent games using that. We're going to see huge volume of folks taking advantage of this. It's great to see.
Yeah, I grew up on the east side, and just kind of that amount of public transit available to get into Seattle was unthinkable when I was growing up in the 90s. So it's fabulous. It was a fun ride. Congresswoman Susan DelBene of the 1st District. She represents parts of Bellevue all the way up to Arlington. Really, really appreciate you, Congresswoman. Thanks for chatting today.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.